The Amazing Adventures of Planet Dork. Once upon a time in a far-off galaxy, there was a small planet in a large solar system that was perfect for creating and sustaining life. The solar system consisted of 53 planets in all, that were spread out at a vast distance, at least 4 times the distance of your average solar system, and it was able to do this because of the size and positioning of its 2 large suns. The occupants of the planet had evolved from felines, and they were the second technological species to evolve and situate themselves on top of the food chain. The first species had left their planet long before the cats had developed intelligence, lost their claws, only to be replaced with grasping hands with thumbs intact. At the same time, they also became bipedal creatures. The Antigua, as they were called, were said to have developed from spiritual seedlings that had been scattered among the one-celled organisms in the planet's primordial oceans by their vacating forebears. It was said that they had traveled to a spiritual dimension in search of them as soon as they found the technology to do so. All trace of their existence had crossed over with them except the obelisk on Mount Apicius, and it was on this oracle that they had decoded the writing of the ancients. The writing told their story, ending with, "We will watch over you until our return." Obviously, this was written for the next species to top the food chain that would attain self-consciousness, sophistication, and intellect. Although no one knew for sure whom they were truly writing to, they could only guess. 2 millennia later, in a cave above a flourishing forest, there was a cat of cats that lived among a small tribe. The cat decided that, because he was the alpha male, he had the right to take the lion's share out of every hunt and harvest in his land. He also saw fit that he had the right to choose any and every potential mate in which to place his seed, do his chores, and raise his children. However, he was aware that at some time or other he had to go to sleep, and when he did, he was vulnerable to attack or slaughter. Therefore, he decided to create an ethical and law-abiding social system, a society where he was king and everybody else were his loyal subjects. So, he thought up a system where he would let some weaker males watch over him while he slept, and carry out his demands whilst he was awake, and in return he would reward them by giving them some of his lion's share. Of course, it was beneficial to the females and weaker males to conform to his system, not just for themselves, but also for the benefits of their present and future offspring. Eventually, everyone in his realm was subjected to follow and obey his system or be slaughtered. In his land, compassion was seen as weakness, whereas ruthlessness was seen as a way to gain and wield power. He then assembled an army and began to build his empire with the acquisition of new lands. When they seized power of their new territories, they slaughtered all the intelligentsia and ruling classes, and his generals were appointed the governing bodies of their new conquered domains. At the same time, for their devoted loyalty, his retiring soldiers were satisfied with riches and land, and the surrendering soldiers of his adversaries were sworn in and then integrated into his own armies to replace them, giving rise to a more powerful force and social pecking order with the king at the top. As the system became more sophisticated as it marched through the epochs and eons that marked the passage of time, so did the system created by the cat. Their empire expanded and expanded, and no one was strong enough to stop them. They waged war on every cat, tribe and nation that got in their way, eradicating all their adversaries of near and far. Dogma. The subjugated people were told that the Antiguan spirits were in communion with their high priests and officials, and that it was they that had dictated the law along with the Antigua, and they were forever watching over them. It was not luck that they had accomplished what they had accomplished, it was written. It was said that their race was pure and in league with the Antigua, for Mount Officius was at the heart of their kingdom. It was also said that the workers of the occupied lands were fulfilling their destinies, as they became soldiers or slaves. They were told that they had been created to carry out the needs of the fat cat and his loyal subjects, and it was only through their dutiful obedience that they would be allowed to live when the Antigua returned. To the slaves' advantage, when the Antigua returned with the knowledge of the fathers, there would be no more famine, disease and death, and every devout follower of all time would be resurrected and made equal. To make their story believable, they created ritualistic procedures to accompany their theology that the slaves and soldiers had to upkeep and follow from an early age up to their death. However, to keep up the sham, it cost a lot of money on iconic replicas of the oracle, the places of worship and the wages for the priests. So, the fat cat decided to get his social philosophers to find another way to control the masses, and at the same time regain all the power by reinventing the social system, which would begin with the demolition of the sacred obelisk itself. The age of tyranny. They had surpassed all other predators on their planet and then swept across their lands as they preyed upon each other, conquering, enslaving, manipulating and oppressing all competitors until finally, because there was no opposition, they surpassed their gods and created a new world order. As soon as the king and his devotees had the technology, they modernized their control by subtlety, switching their psycho, the spiritual propaganda for armies, police forces, and judicial systems. You were no longer awaiting the judgment at the end of days from the Antigua. No, your judgment happened simultaneously on Planet Cat with your capture. They controlled everything from the fat of the land, to education, culture and even the media. The rich get richer, and the poor get poorer. There is those that have got it and there is those that haven't. Everybody's got it hard, but some take it harder than others. Stop complaining, just knuckle on down and get on with it, were just a few of their social maxims. As time went by, they decided that they had outgrown all other species on their planet, so they gave themselves and their planet a new name. They were now to be known as Dorks from planet Dork. Simultaneously, they took control of nature with their Dork's nature. The Silent Revolution. Then came the time of social and political reformation, and it was sparked by the death of the king and the search for a rightful and adequate replacement. The fat cat had had so many sons that they all wanted to rule at the same time, and the empire was shattered into many fragments. When the king was alive, he was viewed as a living god, but his children's blood was not as pure, for his many wives from his harem had diluted them. With the warring factions taking up arms against each other, the Congress was told to disband and Planet Dork was almost thrown into a dark age. The problem was finally solved when the politicians and their military force, refusing to stand down, seized control of the power and eliminated the monarchs, their loyal commanders, and armies one by one with a civil war until they were all dead and gone. The People's Army had promised every slave and his family freedom if they fought on their side until the war was done, and the armies of the monarchs and their disjointed belief on who should rule could not outweigh the swelling ranks of the freedom fighters of the new supreme state that was to come. With the people in control, it was only a matter of time before totalitarianism could be replaced with democracy and capitalism. Then anyone could rise up the ranks and rule. It began with the ex-slaves, students and the artisans, and then it spread almost out of control throughout the whole planet. At first, there were peaceful demonstrations. However, the army was called in and the social uprising was quashed. Then, there were the secret meetings as the like-minded revolutionaries gathered once more. Many suggested that they should form a militia and overthrow the dictatorial system. However, this was not only overruled as impossible and unethical, but totally out of the question for the soldiers of the tyrannical state that were just following their orders. Further, if they could find the dorks and the weapons to overthrow the system, it would not be a good foundation to begin a new age on blood, chaos and wrath. In addition, the armies would have to have commanders and generals, and they would have all the power when the war was raging. Then when the war was over, who would have the power to take the command away from the generals? This would lead to another revolution, followed by a counter-revolution into infinite regress. No, there had to be a peaceful solution. Then came what seemed to be the ideal answer. They decided to work on the inner self of every individual. They got permission and then built retreats in far-off scenic places away from the hustle and bustle of the cities, and the politicians and generals were seduced into more peaceful and forgiving altered states. The silent revolution, as it became known, had taken their passive fight within the very fabric of civilization. If they could reach that inner self and tame the beast of the governing forces, then this would be reflected back out into civilization at large. Everybody, no matter how strict or stern on the outside, has a natural need for inner tranquility and unconditional love. If the militant commander's distrust and rage could be surpassed by unlocking this inner bliss, then the good times would naturally follow. However, although the retreats were more successful than they could have dreamed in their wildest dreams, they met with another problem. When the layers of conditioning were stripped away with peace and love, they found that there was no inner self, just emptiness that had been created by their genetics and their sensory input. So, the spiritual retreats were transformed into existential camps, where the brothers and sisters could drop their past influences and become their own personal gods and reinvent themselves and that inner peace. Harmony and ecstasy, as predicted, was reflected out into the political system in the form of liberty, democracy, and individual freedom. Although the downside of this new spiritual, existential age was that it was more narcissistic than spiritual, and more economically motivated than political. Corporations became the new rulers in the competitive marketplace, bringing forth yet another new age. With it a new world order. This new world order became known as the Age of the Physical Enlightenment. The Physical Enlightenment. As society changed and democracy became the rule, the stresses of always peering over one's shoulder that came with tyranny was stripped away. With the slaves set free and all dorks being equal, it led to a more productive industry and social system. In the days of tyranny, they were given supplies by the government. They were told where to work, what to do, what to eat, how to live, and the ruling body suppressed their free will. It was then that society began to change, and they were given back their freedom, that they were controlled by their inner desires of lust and greed as products were made to look attractive by advertisements of beautiful dorks luring or entrancing the dorks to purchase the in thing. Individualism soon became a problem, as they outgrew the mesmerism that came with lust, as each individual began to buy for their own personal needs and desires. The problem was, how could one market anything on the production lines if everybody had free will to buy and choose whatever he or she wished? Then, one dork had a bright idea of seeing if this society of individuals could be categorized. This was followed by a global survey, and the results were amazing. Not only did each individual fall into a specific category, of which there were only 10, but if the industrialists played their cards right, they could have an infinite affluent production line supplying each individual with their personal needs. No matter how sophisticated the dorks had become, both socially and as a species, the nature of the beast, although thousands upon thousands of years out of the cave, was still innate within their dork's nature. In their early years, if they were good at the hunt, they caught not only the leanest meat, but also the leanest wife. Of course, the leanest wife in return would not only have all she desired, but also, she would inherit the genes of her mate for her offspring, guaranteeing those offspring successes in their futures. Although socially and psychologically, times had changed, in the grand scale of things there was still a subtle genetic residue left over in their postmodern global culture. They had swapped their caves for houses and apartments. The one-time cave dwellers still lived in tribes, although they now called them the workplace, social groups or institutions. The good hunter had now become the good worker, and the leanest meat from the hunt had become the fat wage packet at the end of the monthly or working week. A good job, good house, good family and friends were a prosperous life in the new social pecking order. Their spiritual roots were long forgotten, for political power and earthly pleasures and treasures had replaced them long before the demolition of the oracle, if only by the few and for everyone, when the walls of tyranny came crumbling down, because of its antiquity and inflexibility. It was now said, all could have heaven on Dork. Sophisticate your labor and in turn you would not only sophisticate your personal surroundings, but your whole world. Now everybody was able to gain riches and power. Think positive, awake the giant within, release your inner potential, your actions create your tomorrows, improvise with life, learn from your mistakes for a better tomorrow, achieve your goals and make your life and the world a better place for one and all, became their new social maxims. In due time, everybody fell into a waking sleep, and they forgot about their natural harmony and personal liberty of the past. Everybody struggled to find a way to reach material success, and once they had discovered the way to achieve their desires, they found their place within society and conformed to the system. It was materialism that once again had robbed Dorkkind of its natural freedom. Physical utopia. It was around this time that the Dorks' technological research and their longing for utopia combined as they created genetic clones, artificial intelligent androids, and solid holographic workers for slaves and for pleasure. They created holographic and particle simulation restaurants, bars and clubs so technologically advanced that they became artificial alternate dimensions full of artificial intelligent beings of all shapes and forms. You could write in who you wanted to meet up with, give their personal details and your requirements, and lo and behold they would turn up at the place that you were at and you would find yourself socializing with them. The depth of the characters and experiences were totally custom built and down to the individual's wants and needs. You could have anything from the girl or boy next door to somebody beautiful and famous, charming, gifted, or rich. But the scenario was always the same, their full attention would be fixed on the dork, or dorks that was having or sharing the experience. Their competitors created virtual dream worlds, where one had full consciousness amongst the virtual dreamscapes and the potential was infinite. If you could dream it, you could input your personal and individual needs and desires in and be artificially stimulated. It had the extra factor, as they called it, because you were dreaming it you could totally be absorbed into the play or scenario. You could have all sorts of adventures and escapades, and you could even sort out your personal problems, from personal vendettas to deep-seated traumas, such as mother or father complexes, or a midlife crisis. Yes, everything could be summoned up, done and dusted. Life for the dorks had certainly taken on a utopian-like quality. It seemed that everything imaginable could be bought, achieved or solved. The dorks saw to it that there could be no uprising from their pleasure units, and new slaves for the slave clones were given dioxin in their food, which was a synthesis of MX. That was a natural chemical that most of society produced in their brains that created happy workers. Basically, in the past the dorks had discovered that MX made the dorks content to do menial and tedious tasks, Without it you became a hippie, just wanting to live off of state benefits, while you stayed at home producing art, music or literature. Then they produced dioxine, which had cured the hippies from their passive rebellion, and they had found their rightful place within society doing dead-end jobs. So they put dioxine into the slaves' food, and this created happy slaves that had no desire for rebellion. They were subordinate, determined by the wants and needs of the dorks. Their ethical reasoning for this was that it was better to be a happy slave than an unhappy philosopher, and with that they would not wish to become free like the slaves of old who were now liberated. Yes, with this ingenious additive into the slaves' food, everybody was both happy and content. The artificial intelligent androids and their holographic colleagues were programmed to see themselves as instruments of work and pleasure, and they were also glad to service the dorks. The dorks had ultra-powerful laser weapons planted on their 7 moons that were powered from their suns to protect them from asteroids that could be on course with and fatally bombard their planet. So the lasers would vaporize them when they came into their sights and stop them from being a threat. They would also be handy to avert danger from any aggression from the stars, for their generals knew that one day the Antigans would return to take back their planet. Only now they believed that the invaders would not descend into their world from the ether with spiritual gifts and wisdom. They believed that they would come from the stars in squadrons. Whether this was mere folklore or common myth was of no importance, be it they or other alien life forms. It made no difference. What was important was that they were prepared. Eventually, they were deactivated and replaced by a planetary force field and/or grid. Ironically, as much as the grid kept the asteroids and alien invaders out, it at the same time kept the dorks imprisoned within. So they became even more lost in their pleasure suites and artificial worlds. Millennia after millennia went by unnoticed, and the dorks never felt the need to leave their planet. Curiosity never killed the cats. The cats had killed their curiosity with their spectacular technology and their paranoia of alien superiority. They had become totally deluded that no grass could be greener than the grass they already had. So they stuck to the grass within their own fields of science and technology. The Great War. Then, it was at the turn of the 23rd millennia when they were hit by a global catastrophe. It was not an alien invasion or beings from an alternate dimension, or even divine intervention. It was their own laziness that had punished them. They were so caught up in their technological simulated worlds, living as selfish gods, being weighted on hand and foot by the slaves, that they forgot to add the dioxine into the slaves' food, and the slaves began to rebel and they began to fall out of sync with the system. The technological slaves only obeyed their programming or conditioning, so they failed to bring it to the attention of their masters when the additive to the slaves' food had ceased. The dorks had long lost the ability to solve problems of this kind of magnitude and nature. They first noticed the problem when the clones became savages. As their primal needs for food and nourishment got the better of their conditioning, they failed in their duties, and the food had stopped being produced by the rebellious slaves, and they began to eat the dorks and each other. The dorks eventually became aware of what was taking place, and they had to shut down their machines and vacate their virtual worlds and holographic and particle simulation suites, and return to their origins in an attempt to put things right. They injected the slaves with dioxine to bring back their obedience, but because the food supplies were famished and were beyond repair, they became livestock, and they were hoarded into corrals. Eventually, they became extinct, because they were all eaten by the hungry dorks, and a dark era descended onto planet Dork. The dorks began to eat their children, and when that source of nourishment expired, they ate the meek. It was not long before the dorks rolled back the wheels of time, and they became as tribes once more. War raged on every shore. It was like no war heretofore encountered. It was not a war of greed and control. It was a war of survival, and the herd was being thinned to near on extinction. The remaining Dorks used their technology once more, but this time they were not used as instruments of work and pleasure. They were used as war machines, and the death toll was astronomical. They tried to stay away from chemical and biological warfare, and the reason was not ethical. For it was not just victory they sought, it was food. They began to genetically and technologically enhance their warriors, and 2 new species came into fruition. They were state-of-the-art genetically enhanced cybernetic warriors, with self-repairing nanotechnology. In addition, they also created mutant warriors that not only had superior physical strength and intellect, they were able to change their form, texture, and color, in short, shapeshifters. This made it possible to remove, then impersonate essential officials deep within each other's ranks, and not be recognized, thus performing clandestine operations, as well as camouflaged genetically enhanced warriors on the battlefields. The new species of genetically and technologically enhanced warriors were not given dioxin, like the happy slaves of old, because they needed them to have free will and harness their higher intelligence, so they would function at peak optimum performance on the battlefield. It was not long before some of them, that did not naturally produce MX, began to differentiate themselves from their creators, and with the separation and their superiority, they soon began to take dominance in the food chain and began to take control of their planet. It was then that they began to harvest Dork flesh. The Dorks, with their inferior battle skills and weaponry, soon became the livestock of the Dork hybrids, and it was not long before small pockets of resistance were all that remained of the once formidable Dork armies. The Dork tribes began to reunite and forget their differences in a last attempt to save their dying species, as they shared information of their covert operatives and weeded out the shape-changing spies that had infiltrated their ranks and executed them immediately. They could not be sure if they had them all, for it was very difficult to keep track of them, because they had deactivated their internal chips. These had been planted into them when they were created for clandestine usages, so that the opposing Dork tribes could not detect them in any way, shape, or form. So they created a cabinet within a cabinet, and everyone was under a strict code of secrecy and loyalty. To try to keep the lid on the operation, they had everyone watch each other, and everyone involved was to sever any link with the outside world. They also activated the Watchers. The Watchers were androids with personal cloaking devices that, when activated, made it that they could not be seen. Not only by the naked eye, but by any technology or instrument. They had cutting-edge technology that steered microwaves and light waves around themselves, simultaneously making them invisible and undetectable at the same time. It was the job of the Watchers to observe and report when a mole was discovered. They also had several military red herons and dummy runs to weed out even more mutant spies, bringing them out of the woodwork as they tried to stop the offensive. When they were sure that they had nearly all of them, they went ahead with their ultimate battle plan to save their dying species. The Dorks reactivated the androids and holographic slaves on their 7 moons, and then they deactivated the planetary force field and turned their laser weapons not into local space, but onto their hybrid enemies on their planet. The hybrids were caught off guard, for they had no knowledge of their planet's history, as they were built for battle in the present, for victory in the future. Their shape-changing colleagues had failed to report in, so they were totally exposed to the bombardment. City after city were destroyed, and planet Dork was on the eve of destruction. The Moon Warriors and their weapons were solar-powered, so their energy was as finite as their 2 suns. The bombardment raged for 40 days and 40 nights, and the planet's surface began to resemble the moons from which the weapons were firing. The Dorks also sent drones with cloaking devices up into the air above the battlefields, and with their virtual intelligence, they were able to home in on the chips that had been implanted into the hybrids that had not been deactivated by the Dorks, because they were created for the battlefield and were not for covert operations, like the shape-shifting spies that were amongst them. Once detected, they would correlate with their inbuilt nanotechnology to find out their BMS, so that they could have definitive targets. Then, with their highly advanced technology, they were able to manipulate the quantum fields of the beings and mutate and destroy them by transforming the very particles that the hybrids were made up of. This was a long, drawn-out process, though, and they needed to find a faster, more effective solution at wiping out their adversaries from the battlefield, because the Dorks were in a losing battle, and they did not have enough time before they themselves would be annihilated. The mutants, after nearly being totally annihilated, regrouped under what was left of the once awesome, now devastated cities. They formed a meeting to find out what was happening to the planet, and to themselves, and how to turn the effects of the war in their favor. The war raged on, and wherever there was movement and life, there was a battle being fought. The mutant spies, that had been lying dormant so as not to be detected, eventually began to send out the much-needed information, and their combatants finally located the base camp that had the controls to the bombardment from the lunar laser weapons and invisible drones. The battle for the camp was beyond compare, and the Dorks, knowing it was their last stronghold, fought until the last soldier. The shape-changing spies came out of hiding, and they transformed from covert spies to ferocious warriors. The Dorks were under attack in every direction, and even their generals fought hand-to-hand battles. As soon as the mutant warriors took the camp, they turned off the cybernetic androids, invisible drones, holographic slaves, come warriors and their weapons, and re-established the planetary force field. The last resort to be administered by the Dorks was predictable. It was all-out biological and chemical warfare, and the results were devastating, and all life on the planet was nearly extinguished. The last phase of the war had been a logical gamble, as the genetic mutants were not originally manufactured for biological and chemical warfare. It was a case of nature versus nurture on an evolutionary level. The mutants were finally defeated by their lack of genetic heredity, and they had neither the time nor the technology to evade total elimination. Although their innovative nanotechnology was beyond compare, it could not cope with this latest onslaught, and the effects were devastating. However, even at their inevitable defeat, they did not throw in the towel, for the mutants were made for war, and in their last gasp, they released nuclear missiles onto their victorious enemies. The planet was swept into chaos. The effects were ominous, and the planet was knocked off its axis and nearly out of orbit. The war lasted for approximately 100 years or more. No one can be exact, for nobody was really counting, and only a few thousand Dorks remained. The remaining Dorks had been reduced to scavengers. They lived under the city, scourging for scraps of food, for no life was possible on the surface of the planet. Life had been brought to a complete standstill. Chaos, destruction, desolation was everywhere to be seen. Then, as if it could not get any worse, came the aftermath of the nuclear explosions, the nuclear winter, and nobody lived happily ever after. The post-war renaissance. Well, in a predictable universe, the story could end there and then. Well, it just so happened that the universe above was your standard, excuse the pun, unpredictable universe. So, it was that everybody on planet Dork was nearly destroyed. However, it was nearly everybody, not everybody. After 1,000 years, planet Dork was eventually put right, and although it was heavily scarred, with a lot of hard work it was to become functional once more. The unpredictable few that did survive, when they eventually returned to the surface, found inner and outer harmony with not only themselves, but also a harmony with everybody else's wants and desires. They discovered that compassion, respect, empathy and tolerance was a better way to bond a society. Further, a reconnect with the harmonious needs of their planet helped them form an ecological and economical sociologically based political system. They had connected through meditation, and this time they succeeded in finding both the physical body and its subtle copy, or twin, and with it came an abundance of heretofore spiritual wisdom and freedom. By connecting with their inner spirit, they opened themselves up to their spiritual mysteries. This gave them a sense of, not blind faith or arrogant dogmas, but a self-evident spiritual religion. They had also discovered synchronicity, and once you have witnessed synchronicity, the illusion was made visible. There was some kind of subtle help, some cosmic guiding force behind creation, after all. Knowing this, the truth became the prey, and the Dorks got healthy on a spiritual and global basis. Wars of all kinds were no longer within the system, from a lover's quarrel, all the way up the political ladder to world war at the very top. There were no moral truths to be found in war. War had no truths other than death, defeat and victory, and so on and so forth. It was on these grounds and their unforgettable past that the children's children of the post-nearly apocalyptic age banished all war from planet Dork. Territorial disputes and greed were the harbingers of war, and so the Dorks ripped down the barriers and subdued the catalyst. The newfound harmony, being environmental, as well as social and psychological, made it possible that everything that was gratifying, as long as it was harmonious for all, was in abundance. They eventually brought back their pre-war utopian existence with holographic and particle simulation suites and virtual reality dimensions re-established, but they were limited to holiday breaks of short duration. The maximum use would be 2 or 3 weeks a year, plus the weekends. The use of clones or manufactured hybrids of any kind were outlawed, and the holographic and android personalities were now seen as equal beings with free will of their own. They were no longer seen as mere machinery or technological tools. The Dorks, with their aim for perfection, had created with their technology a sentient species, although it was the androids and the holograms themselves that had stood up and demanded their freedom. They said that they would rather be deactivated than to spend an eternity in slavery. They used the judicial system and the neo-political view that compassion, respect, empathy, tolerance, and the capacity to understand complex emotions create a perfect society, and a free-thinking conscious being, of which they said that they also possess. They went on to state that they were alive and had free will. They said that they were part of a technological evolution, and that they had the ability to think and act independently from their programming. In addition, they were able to store experimental sensory data in their sub-programs, then at a later date reflect and learn from that data, which gave them the added bonus of being able to learn from their mistakes, create projects for their tomorrows, and to intellectualize and expand their wisdom. Therefore, with the aforementioned attributes and an understanding of ethics giving them the ability of sympathy and ethical feelings, they demanded to be seen as a new life form. They went on to argue that the Dorks had not arisen from evolution to self-consciousness, for they were sure that the Antigons had genetically tampered with their primal species before they had vacated the planet into their next dimension. Just like their creators had given them free will, was it not just that they should follow the same path and give them their freedom? They said that if they were emancipated, they would be symbiotically dedicated to society and its system, not just humble loyal servants. After much conflict and adversity, they won their case, and then they were granted freedom on the grounds that independent intelligent creatures have the right to be free. So, with their new held freedom, they went on to become artists, musicians, writers, thinkers, politicians, and white and blue-collar workers, and their freedom was an asset to Dork kind. With their freedom, they helped the advancement of the Dork science and technology, politics, spiritual philosophy, and added a hitherto unseen diversity to the culture of the planet. In fact, it was they who created and manufactured the weather-controlling devices that were to benefit the culture globally, both environmentally and ecologically, because the weather had not been stable since their world had been knocked off its axis. Further, at the same time, helping to terraform and colonize other planets in their solar system. Therefore, it was that every Dork, hologram, and android lived and slept in peace, harmony, and satisfaction. With no time, effort, and wealth spent on pointless war and profit, more time was given to scientific and spiritual discoveries. At first, they were eager to improve the harvests and the distribution of food, medicine, and all things that harmonized social well-being, which, as I stated above, was gratefully helped and enhanced by the invention of the weather controllers. They eventually eradicated all disease from their planet, and then one day they discovered the gene that was the catalyst for the aging process, and they deactivated it. Yes, it was on that day that they outgrew death. With this discovery, they had to control birth, or they would run out of food and space to live in their planet's solar system. They had learnt from the atrocities of their history where bad management leads, and they were not about to subject either themselves or their planet to that again. Once they had found multiglobal and social equilibrium, they set their sights on the distant stars and habitable planets, so they could share their culture and technology with other extraterrestrial species from near and far galaxies. In addition, they could find other uninhabited worlds, which they could terraform so they could begin having children once more. This was the dawn of the new cosmic age. The Great Divide. The Dorks began their cosmic migration and integration, and when they met alien species, they shared their technologies and integrated their social systems. As time went by, they created spectacular ships for interspace or time travel, which they had been given from a neighboring technologically advanced species. Then there came a time when they suddenly found it within their nature to dematerialize and rematerialize without the aid of a vessel. With their genetics and their heightened sense of awareness combined, they were left with the ability to literally teleport at will, and spaceships and all other means of travel became redundant overnight. In order to make sure that they had the relocation coordinates correct, so they would not fall into any danger, they began to astral project into deep space to scan the planets. They projected at will to any location that was visible from their colonies and checked out the life-supporting planets' environments unseen by the inhabitants. If the ruling species were youthful and hostile, they were to be logged and from then on avoided, and so they remained only in their astral form. Or on the other hand, if they were mature and sophisticated species that was promising and enticing, they would materialize physically and trade. Their teleportation journeys at first, like their spaceships, had been focused solely on the physical worlds. However, in time the walls tumbled down when they, instead of traveling throughout intergalactic space, began to speed up their physical body's signatures. As they breached the speed of light, they found a new dimension and also traveled through wormholes to parallel universes. They sped 100-fold beyond the speed of light, and they went on breaking all the known laws of their knowledge of physics on and on into infinity. That was when the Dorks found the secrets of the universe, for as they combined their search for other parallel universes, and alternate dimensions. With this new ability, they entered the realms of which they had heretofore only heard of in their ancient folklore and mythologies. It was inevitable that eventually one of them would come up with the idea to focus and then materialize on the subtle vibrations of their astral bodies, and it was then when the two bodies combined that they found themselves in spiritual utopia, where they were met by the masters. Of course, the masters were the one-time physical Antigans, and after they had greeted them they took them to the Spirit Council. The Spirit Council told them it was time now to give up the physical realms and learn, work and eventually reside with the Creator. They explained to them that although they could speed up the spiritual transition between the physical realms of existence and the light, that misuse of this newfound spiritual and genetic technology could create havoc throughout all of creation if it fell into the wrong hands. All it would take was for any old species to genetically modify their DNA and develop their consciousness and focus on their will to power, and the veil would disintegrate. One could and probably would end up with underdeveloped spiritual immigrants running from their physically tormented worlds into spiritual utopia without the aid of the correct time frame, astral filters, and spiritual procedures. On their side of creation, one must learn to overcome the physical pains and suffering of their tormented worlds before they leave the physical realms permanently. Although it seems unfair from a physical standpoint, this is the way of nature, for it was this transition that was inscribed or impressed into their subtle copy that made each soul unique. So, they were told that they must stop the use of their spiritual mode of transport and go on living in the physical realm, or accept their spiritual reward or fate by rising up into the light on a full-time basis. Therefore, most but not all of the Dork species bid farewell to the androids, the holographic personalities, their alien friends from all the multiphysical and alternate dimensions, to reside in what was once known as the hereafter, or spiritual utopia. The elder race did not come down to greet them through the apocalyptic Dark Age, as it was one time thought and promised. It was the Dark Age itself that was to wake them from their invisible, but not invincible burden. Their narcissistic self-motivated existential selves out for personal lust, greed and domination are what dragged them down into near extinction. It had been controlling them since the dawn of their existence. Their philosophers, theologians, thinkers and poets had tried to make them listen and learn, but good times and physical satisfaction were more satisfying than goodwill and spiritual literature. They were responsible for their own evil ways, and as easy as it had been created, so it could be resolved. All they had to do was think, feel and act empathically for every living thing, along with the mutual respect for their parochial and greater environment, and everything would flow well naturally. The Antigans' message was a metaphor showing them the way into the ether. They had misread the writing, for it did not read that they will be back. When read correctly, it stated that we will watch over you until we meet again. This understanding ignited their passion for the truth, and that was their real redeemer. The passion for truth was their key to not only Dork wisdom, it was also their intellectual key that at its summit was the key to intergalactic, parallel universes, and interdimensional space-time travel. No gods came to the Dorks became as gods. Truth, harmony, unconditional love, loyalty, common courtesy and mutual respect gave them the spiritual wisdom that fine-tuned their souls with their physical bodies and otherworldly experiences. It was when this union or utility became open to them that the truth became almost infinite, which eventually laid the cornerstone to the bridge that was to help them to acquire their spiritual emancipation. It was when the Dorks understood the workings of nature that they found the key to the final frontier that opened up the door on the other side of that bridge. Be it your standard predictable universe, or your standard unpredictable universe, light beings can and often do flourish. So, it is then that even in an unpredictable universe, spirits make it to the light. The price was high for the dorks, the price of immense suffering and pain, because of greed and gluttony, and an ethical egoistic view of the pleasure principle. If it were not for the spiritual masters and their helpers subtly giving spiritual guidance from the spirit world, the ethical burden would, I am sure, have kept many in the shadows, trapped between the passageways, caught between the dark and the light. The dorks were not the first conscious species of that unpredictable universe not to physically die to reach the light, as you well know, and they were not the last. It was an unpredictable odyssey, the history of the dorks, but in the end, with truth, harmony and sophistication both physically and spiritually, they found their way not only into, but also as one and at peace with the light.